have my, thank you. All right, everyone. Welcome to the webinar this afternoon. My name is Katie Church. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the school-based prevention coordinator at the Maine Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And today we're going to be talking about the Children's Safety Partnership and what it means when we put policy into practice. Before we get going, I just want to note that we are going to be talking about child sexual abuse as we go through our time together today. So I would encourage you to do what you need to take care of yourself, take a break, turn your camera off, stand up and stretch, get a drink of water. Feel free to leave. This is being recorded, so it'll be available again in the future to you. I do recognize that this is a webinar, but I also love interaction. And so a lot of this is information sharing. And so I encourage you to throw questions in the chat. I'm very excited to have my prevention teammate, Lisa Ravar, here today, who's going to be monitoring the chat and keeping tabs on things. And there's going to be time at the end for questions as well. So without further ado, we are going to get going, unless there are any questions before we do that, and feel free to unmute yourself or drop things in the chat. All right, here we go. So we are going to be talking about the Children's Safety Partnership, and part of that is really exploring the evolution of the child sexual abuse response law in Maine. So Maine's version of Aaron's Law, which is a law that can be found nationwide regarding child sexual abuse prevention response. We're going to be talking about the partnership that has developed between the Maine Department of Education, MICASA, and the local sexual assault support centers. We'll talk about the process we actually went through to implement the law, as well as go over some of the materials that are available to folks who are responsible for implementing this in their location. And we'll talk about the technical assistance that we have provided in regards to the Children's Safety Partnership. And then, like any piece of legislation, like any programming, there have been successes and there have been challenges and there have been bumps along the way. And so we will be talking about those as well. And because this started with a piece of legislation, this slideshow is broken down into kind of this timeline that you see ahead of you. And so to kind of keep things organized in chunks, wherever the box is, that is the time period that we're talking about. And so we're going to start by talking about 2015, which is the year that the legislation came to be. And the title of the legislation is an act to require education in public preschool programs and elementary schools regarding child sexual abuse. This was put forth by a representative from down east Maine. And the objective was to require sexual abuse prevention, education, and response in all school districts in Maine with a publicly funded pre-K through grade 5 program, which is most of the districts, if not all of the publicly funded ones. Initially, this went through quite the series of rewrites and edits. Initially, it was actually written to be a pre-K through grade 12 endeavor, but over time, pre-K through grade 5 was where things settled. And the way this law was written included these components. And so these 5 things are outlined in the law text that you can find through one of the resources I'll be sharing with you shortly. And the law itself covers what an individual who works in a school needs to know about the response and reporting procedures when it comes to child sexual abuse. And so if they receive a disclosure, if that individual receives a disclosure, what is their role? What do they then need to do to ensure the safety of that child? It also covers awareness training and education for school personnel, and we'll talk about what that looks like. It also requires age-appropriate child sexual abuse prevention education for students that's aligned to the system of learning results, and in this case, the Maine learning results, and delivered by qualified instructors. And they go on to define that as folks who are comfortable and confident in talking about child sexual abuse and these kind of tenets of prevention work. And then on the larger end, this law also mandates that school districts on the whole need to have a policy about child sexual abuse response and reporting procedures that's actually separate from the mandated reporting procedures that they already have in place. And so what this means is that anybody who works for the district understands not only the individual role in responding to and reporting child sexual abuse, but what the system looks like throughout the district. If there is a person who makes all of the mandated reports as opposed to the individuals, if there is a policy in place for safety planning, kind of what that all looks like. And then finally, the law mandates that victims of child sexual abuse and their non-offending caregivers have access to services and support. So it's a lot of things in this piece of legislation for that pre-K through grade 5 level. But the thing I want to point out is while the prevention education is limited to that pre-K through grade 5, all of these other pieces apply to the entire district. So anyone who is affiliated with that district, all school personnel, all staff, all volunteers, et cetera. And so this piece of legislation was met with some barriers. Initially, this bill was vetoed by the governor. That veto was overturned. The legislation was actually written with a fiscal note, but no funding included. And so you see your screen this screenshot of the actual fiscal note, and you'll note under local cost, it's indicating that it's insignificant statewide. And so here was this expectation that these policies be created, that these systems of supports be created, but there was no funding to go along with it. And that fed into the already existing concerns about decreased bandwidth and resources for schools as they go through the implementation process. You know, this was coming on the heels of the suicide prevention mandates that were coming through. And so schools were going through the suicide prevention training. Schools were going through making sure they had their mandated reporter policies in place. And so here was another thing being added that potentially was going to be a barrier in how this was going to be implemented. And so ultimately, recognizing this decreased bandwidth, it led to this Children's Safety Partnership, which was a partnership among the Maine Coalition Against Sexual Assault, the Maine Department of Education, and the local sexual assault support centers. Recognizing that the Maine Department of Education has the expertise in school approval and school policies, recognizing that the local sexual assault support centers and the Maine Coalition Against Sexual Assault have the expertise in prevention education and best practices in being trauma informed in child sexual abuse prevention and response. And so this partnership came together to support schools with the implementation of this law, recognizing that there isn't capacity at the district level for many, if not most districts, to do this on their own. So any questions about that initial launch of the legislation, what the law covers, before we go into the development process of the resources? Okay, again, there will be plenty of time for questions at the end. I do see something coming in. That is a great question, Maddie. The question is, are private schools expected to provide this education? They are not. So they are exempt from this as it only applies to publicly funded schools. Ideally, we would love for private schools to be engaging in this, but it's not part of the mandate. Thanks for asking that. And so now we move into 2018. So here we are 3 years later, because it took a significant chunk of time to create the resources that we felt were going to be helpful and that we heard would be helpful to school districts. And so the first resource I'm sharing with you today is the Children's Safety Partnership website, which is childrensafetypartnership.org. And we will get that in the chat for you all. This is a website for anybody who has ever sat in a room with me on a training around this. You'll hear me say, know it, love it, bookmark it. It's a website we're exceptionally proud of because it is a hub for not just schools in implementing this policy, but also for community members, for students. It has resources such as, here are some books you can read. Here are some conversation starters if you're engaging with a child in your life. Here are some coloring pages. For school personnel who have gone through trainings with us in the past, it has a back page where they can access the resources from the training or supplemental materials that will be helpful if they're engaging with folks in their districts. And it also contains contact information for the local sexual assault support centers. So anybody can come to this website, learn about the Children's Safety Partnership, learn about the law and policy, and then also be able to connect with the center closest to them who can support them with this law. And to supplement the website, and this is directly linked to the website and will be provided in a handout towards the end, we have this implementation guide. And this guide was created in partnership with MICASA and the Department of Ed, with funding and support from the Department of Health and Human Services. And basically it breaks down all of the language associated with this policy. What is meant by evidence informed? What is meant by trauma informed? What do we mean by qualified instructors? What are those 5 components of the law? How does this need to work out in practical application? What are the requirements for prevention education? And so this has kind of become the one-stop shop for like a tangible document that folks can use to learn about the context and practical application for the pieces of the law. I think to date, we've distributed something like 2,000 copies far and wide, and that's not accounting for any of the downloads that would come from the website, which are also plentiful because it is a resource that we readily give to folks. And then recognizing that writing a policy from the ground up is really challenging, we have the model policy that was crafted by the Maine Department of Education. And so this is just a brief kind of snip of what the actual model policy says, but it's available on the Children's Safety Partnership website. And it really breaks down what the Department of Education is looking for schools to have in their policy. And so it gives the definitions. It also goes on to further talk about what needs to be outlined, and folks can use it then to base their policy on. And I'm seeing in the chat that Lisa is providing these resources as we go along. And so that was a really helpful framing, particularly knowing that this law and compliance with the law and having the policy is part of school approval in the state of Maine. And so basically the objective of this partnership is to make the implementation of this law as easy as possible, recognizing again that there's that reduced bandwidth and that school personnel already have so much on their shoulders. And so if there's one thing we can do to support them with this, we're going to try to do it to the best of our ability. And this extends further into kind of these template-based tools that we created. And so districts were able to come together with this child sexual abuse prevention action plan to figure out kind of what their goals for policy are, what it's going to look like in training their personnel, what it's going to look like when they're applying their curriculum strategies. It's kind of allowing them to figure out who's responsible for what pieces, the timeline they're following. And so a lot of districts used these tools as a way to craft what their next steps were going to be, what their policy was going to look like. So between this and the implementation guide and the model policy, it really created the infrastructure to support districts with crafting the policies and resources they needed for this law. And then there's one of my, I'm biased, all-time favorite resources, which is this Kids in Space, Bodies and Boundaries Coloring and Activity book. And this was designed to reinforce prevention education happening at schools. It is a resource that school personnel have used in their classrooms. It's a resource that has been sent home because of these things called Together pages, which you see referenced here, which are designed to provide prompts for young people to do with their caring adults. And so it provides information, talking about online safety or talking about emotions and empathy, or who somebody might feel comfortable having in their personal space bubble, things of that nature. It was intentionally designed to reflect language that relates to protective factors for sexual violence prevention. And so nowhere does it explicitly name this is how you stop child sexual abuse. Instead, it's using things like, let's talk about feelings, let's talk about empathy, because we know that with more empathy, with kindness, with communication and conversations about bodies and boundaries, that decreases the likelihood that sexual violence is going to be perpetrated. And so it was designed to provide kind of that open door to have these conversations and provide prompts to engage in these conversations around a topic that can be really challenging to talk about. And there are a whole bunch of different activities in here. And so we have the pages where you can color in people's faces that match an emotion, or word searches, or coloring pages, or matching activities. And so very much designed to hopefully give every learner the opportunity to engage in a way that feels comfortable and safe for them. We have sample pages of this on the Children's Safety Partnership website. And if you're interested in getting a copy or several of these, your local sexual assault support center has many, many available. And we can get some to you for sure. And so this is a resource that has existed really since the start of the program, and has been a really helpful way to support the work that the schools are doing, and also give the opportunity for this to be, give folks the opportunity to engage in this in their communities and at home. And so with this, knowing we have the website, the implementation guide, the model policy, the template tools, the coloring book, we then worked towards a regional training model. And so we started with 5 locations around Maine. You'll see the map here, which is also our catchment area map. So it's showing which centers represent which areas. We started with 5 locations. You'll notice that they're mainly down the 95 corridor to make it as accessible as possible. And we made sure that wherever we were in the state, we had the local sexual assault support centers there to talk about the programming that they have and the ways that they can support centers and schools and districts with this work. And so from 2018 to 2019, we offered 13 regional trainings. And this was a mix of our training of trainers to equip folks to give the 1-hour training, which I'll talk about in just a minute, and also some curriculum trainings and supporting districts with crafting their prevention programming and messaging in compliance with this law. And so the whole core of this, when it comes to the school personnel training, is that every school personnel has to go through 1-hour training. And so we spent time crafting that training first, noting that it's required for all school personnel, not just teachers, but counselors, social workers, food services, custodial arts, transportation, coaches, volunteers, activities coordinators, anybody associated with the school, with the exception of kind of the one-off, like, HVAC person coming in to fix something that's broken one time. Everybody else associated with the school has to go through this training. We recognize that this is challenging content, and so we worked on this training of trainers to hopefully equip folks to feel like they are qualified instructors and can give this 1-hour training. So they're comfortable and confident and skilled at talking about child sexual abuse, and has a little bit of insight as to what the district's policy might be. It has to be a minimum of 1 hour, although I'm sure any of the prevention educators on this call would tell you that 1 hour never seems to be quite enough. And ideally, it would be more than 1 hour, because there's just a lot of content to talk about. And we want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that is trauma informed and supportive of all of the learners in the space. The training materials need to be evidence informed. The training itself needs to be completed within 6 months of hire and updated every 4 years. And so we often encourage districts to offer 2 rounds of the 1-hour training during the school year to catch folks that might come in halfway through. And then we're actually coming to the end of the first 4-year cycle of this. And so part of the work that I'm going to be doing in collaboration with the centers going forward is figuring out what changes we might need to make to ensure that the content is still relevant and still supports the implementation of this law. And so when we do this 1-hour training, this is what we're covering. And this is why 1 hour often isn't quite enough, because we're talking about the law and policy. We're giving the foundational pieces for what child sexual abuse is. We're talking about sexual development, what is developmentally appropriate or potentially problematic. We're talking about how to respond to disclosures, or how do you respond when you see a sexual behavior, or if you have suspicions of child sexual abuse. We talk about understanding your district's policy and response and referral system. So what it looks like when you're making a mandated report regarding child sexual abuse, as there are some nuances there, some tricky pieces that are a little different than if you're making just a general mandated report. And then we want to talk about local resources. And so it's a lot to cram into an hour and a lot to give people adequate time to process through. And so recognizing that while we have truly incredible prevention educators in this state, we don't have enough for every single school district. And so we spent time creating this training of trainers to equip folks in the school districts to give that 1 hour training. And so that's this training of trainers model here. It's a 4-hour training. And the way that we have it established is we have the 1 hour training, the PowerPoint and the resources for it. And then we have slides incorporated into it that allow for a deeper conversation about how to deliver some of the content, how to respond to some of the things that might come up when you're delivering this training. We spend a lot more time going into the law and the associated policies, so folks have a good understanding of why they're going into a space and talking about this 1 hour training. And then we have group activities that allow for skill building. So supporting folks in talking about child sexual abuse, kind of activities that might actually support people to pause and check their own assumptions about how the content is delivered. And so all of that is woven into this 4-hour training with the hope that somebody will go through it and then feel confident to go back to their school district and deliver the 1 hour training to the staff in their spaces. And then we created this curriculum-based training. So for the folks who would be responsible for doing the prevention education in their school and have conversations about what this looked like and how it could be applied. And so the law itself notes that the prevention education for pre-K through 5 needs to include that age-appropriate education around boundaries, and then also biologically accurate body terminology. It has to include how you help children identify unsafe or uncomfortable situations. It talks about recognizing feelings and recognizing how your body might feel if your boundary is violated, or how it might feel or how somebody else might look and feel if their boundaries are violated. It helps children identify safe adults with whom they could talk to if they ever feel unsafe or uncomfortable. And it also supports children to support a friend who might be experiencing something that's unsafe or uncomfortable. And so these are all things that are required by this law for this pre-K through grade 5 level. And a lot of it was stuff that districts were already doing, just not under the lens of child sexual abuse prevention. But we know that so many of those protective factors are to prevent child sexual abuse, among many other types of abuse and violence. And so this training was an 8-hour training that began with going over the 1 hour just so folks had a context for why we were in this space together. We talked about best practices for primary prevention, including things like the dosage and how the prevention education is delivered and being culturally relevant in the space, and what it means to be a qualified instructor. We looked at existing curriculum resources. And so we looked at lessons from Advocates for Youth, their rights, respect, and responsibility curriculum. We looked at some units from the Second Step curriculum. And then we gave folks the opportunity to look at these lessons and kind of do a teach back with their peers. And so really run through how they might deliver of this content and create spaces, feedback, and to process how this might look in practical application. And so that was the work that we did from 2018 to 2019. So all of the resources and the launch of all of the trainings that we have available. I want to pause really quickly to see if folks have any questions so far. Okay. And so now we move into 2019 into very, very early 2020. And the reason I focus on this period of time is because we actually took all of the feedback from every single training we did in 2018 and 2019 and subsequently completely revamped all of the trainings and the materials. I did this work in really solid collaboration with the local centers. We wanted to make sure that what we were delivering felt relevant and useful for folks. And the initial feedback we got built a solid foundation, but there was a lot of room for improvement. And ultimately, as a result, we ended up tabling the curriculum trainings because it was exactly what folks were looking for. And we had feedback that folks often left with more questions than they came in with. And that was not the ultimate intention. And so kind of as an interim, as a stopgap type thing, we created a curriculum guidance document to offer to folks, and that basically outlines those components of the prevention education piece that I spoke about a little earlier, and then showed lessons, books, activities that folks could do that aligned with those. And so somebody could print off that implementation or that curriculum guidance document and be able to say, I teach first grade, here's a lesson I can do that covers boundaries. And there we go. And so it was a little kind of like a scope and sequence, but not quite as formalized. The other thing we did was when we were doing the training of trainers, we added more activities. We added more of those skill building pieces because so many folks provided feedback that they got a really solid understanding of what the law was, but when it came time to actually present it, there seemed to be some missing pieces about how to do the thing. And so we added skill building activities. We revamped the structure of the slides for the training of trainers to add more of that information about how do you even begin to train somebody on this information. And then for the folks who had attended trainings in the past, we started a newsletter, an e-newsletter that would go out with resources or new information, or, this curriculum guidance document went out in a newsletter for folks. So they have more tools that they can work with. And then we added those resources to the back page of the Children's Safety Partnership website that folks could access. And so it was this massive undertaking to ensure that we could provide trainings and provide resources that were going to be helpful in supporting folks with this implementation. Because again, our objective is to try to make the implementation of this as easy as possible. And so that was why we spent so much time doing this revamp. And I will tell you that we revamped it and it was in this beautiful, shiny new format. And the last training I did with the Midco Center, the last day of that training was March 13th, 2020, which was the day that essentially everything started shutting down here in Maine. And so that was one of those moments of, okay, we just did all this stuff. Hold on, we need to take a pause and figure out what is next. And so here we are at COVID and beyond, because it really truly influenced how we proceeded with the Children's Safety Partnership and the resources available going forward. And so the first thing we had to do was really take a step back and figure out, how do we take all of these materials, all of the trainings, how do we take something as nuanced as child sexual abuse prevention education and adapt it for virtual learning? And so we made changes initially to the curriculum guidance document to note what lessons were distance learning friendly or provide options for tweaking things so they could become distance learning friendly. We created virtual versions of all of the trainings, which added interactive features like polls and Mentimeter and Padlet, and really trying to bolster engagement wherever possible. We also created a video recording of the 1 hour training, recognizing, so they were hiring more people to be able to engage with the content and to support students with virtual learning, but that meant they still had to go through this training. And so we created this video version that folks could go through. We started having regular peer calls with the sexual violence prevention educators throughout the state to talk through what they needed to be able to support the folks in their catchment areas with doing the work and with this implementation of the CSP law. And then we increased email communication with the folks who had gone through the training in the past to provide additional resources and supports, recognizing that everything they had known about teaching had been completely flipped upside down, and that the already decreased bandwidth that exists was even more decreased because of everything going on with COVID. So it took kind of a solid step back. We had a lot of really fabulous folks from the centers reaching out and saying, we recognize that this is a really unprecedented time. We just want to let you know we're here. Let us know what you need. And then they could respond from there. And so it really was a solid pause in learning and figuring what we needed to do to support folks. And it always started with the changes to the documents, allowing folks the opportunity to offer some of these things virtually, and then working with partners like Maine Family Planning to learn from them about how they had adapted some of their pieces for virtual learning as well. And so we crafted this document of best practices for online teaching and learning because we know that prevention education needed to continue even though everything was remote. And so this guide was intended for the sexual violence response centers, prevention educators to kind of think about and how they engage in virtual prevention programming, because there's some pieces of child sexual abuse prevention education that are inherently unsafe to do virtually. And so it's figuring out kind of how to evaluate the needs of the student in doing the prevention education. How do you respond to a disclosure if you're in a virtual setting? How do you ensure that your point person at the school is in the space when it's an entire Brady Bunch of young people on the screen that you're trying to have a conversation with about boundaries or empathy or things of that nature? And so we also shared this resource for those doing prevention work in their communities because it had a lot of interesting pieces about, crafting your prevention messaging and also validating points like, holy moly, when you're adapting live lessons for a virtual environment, it takes a lot more time than people realize. And so it was a really hard shift, and we wanted folks to know that they had resources and also to feel validated that it was hard, and it still is hard. And so this resource was one that was created and shared as well. Knowing that the bandwidth of school personnel was even more limited than before, and knowing that the law didn't go away, they still needed to do prevention education, we created lesson plans to go with each page of the Kids in Space book to support teachers in complying with that prevention education piece. We know that many schools used Kids in Space as kind of a stopgap for prevention during periods of remote learning. It was something that they could send home really easily. It was something that they could, post one of the pages to their Google Classroom or whatever platform they were using and encourage kids to engage with and then respond to. And so all of the lessons were designed to be short. It came with a script, it came with discussion questions, and then things to consider when delivering. And so this was a tool that was used and that we were able to send out and was available again on that back page of the website for school personnel to be able to use. I also want to speak to the incredible programming and offerings that all of the prevention educators were putting out there. We had everything from podcasts to Google Classrooms to, fully adapted virtual programming that kept even preschoolers engaged, which is truly incredible when you think about it. And so really it was a group effort in figuring out, okay, how do we make the implementation of this possible, even if it's done through a computer, even if some of it might actually be asynchronous? How do we engage in this work together? And so where are we now? We're still engaging with school personnel. I do conference presentations. We've done presentations with the curriculum leaders, school counselors, health and physical education groups, school nurses. We're still doing the newsletters, which you see a screenshot of on your screen, and recognizing that we're not in person very much. anymore, if at all. We're mailing things to people. We're mailing Kids in Space books. We're mailing posters and other Children's Safety Partnership materials, mailing children's books, things that can support folks in doing the work. And so before I go into where we're going, I do want to pause again just to see if folks have questions about that adaptation period that we went through with the onset of COVID.
I just want to say good work. Holy cow, that's a lot. That really is.
Thank you.
Good work.
Thank you. Yeah, I could not have done any of it without the prevention educators and without the support of the folks around the state and the school personnel willing to chat with us. All right, and I'm seeing a question. Sending home parent caregiver letters is common for puberty education, and sometimes caregivers choose to opt out their child. Is this the same for K-5 child abuse prevention education? Fabulous question. And it's something that we still are running into, whether it's in person or virtual settings. And so many of our centers, if not all of them, do still send home that letter of, hey, we're going to be talking about this content. We, through the guidance of some of the folks from the Department of Ed, have stopped having an opt-out option right on that form, but instead it says, yes, I'll have my child participate, or I have questions about this and would like to talk to somebody more about this. Sometimes it's a matter of a misunderstanding or an assumption that in talking about bodies and boundaries, we're going to be saying words like child sexual abuse or bringing up sex or things of that nature. And so sometimes a clarifying conversation with whoever's providing the education can ease some of the nerves that might come with this subject matter. But yes, we still have the parent and caregiver letter, and they still can absolutely opt out if after talking to somebody, they do not want their child to engage in that, for sure. Very good question. Thank you for raising that. Any other questions? All right, so where are we going? So we have these training materials. We have the virtual training materials, and we're at the end of that first 4-year cycle. And so we're coming up on the folks who took the very first 1-hour training in 2018 are going to be taking it again this coming fall. And so we're going to be spending time just reviewing all of the training materials, reviewing the 1 hour to ensure that, our statistics are updated, the content is still relevant. There hasn't been any major changes to policies that would determine changes we'd need to make to the training material. So we'll be spending time working on that. We're also recognizing that because of the pandemic, there are probably districts throughout the state that still aren't quite at the point where they might have a policy or a plan for prevention education. And so we're hoping that we'll be able to do some sort of survey or needs assessment to figure out, does your district have a policy? If not, what tools or supports would you be interested in to support you with that? Does your district engage in prevention education? If yes, what kind of education do you do? What do you talk about? If not, what kind of resources would be helpful for this? Just to get a feel of where folks are in implementing this law and to figure out what kind of supports and resources we could be building to support people in this work. And then recognizing again that we have these amazing prevention educators throughout the state providing prevention education, but that maybe when those kiddos go home, it's not being resourced in the community. We're embarking on a curriculum project where we're creating resources that our prevention educators can share when they're doing this education for pre-K through 5, but also creating materials that can supplement that and can go home to families and caregivers or to community centers or to any space where people are interacting with kids. And so we're hoping to create kind of this comprehensive and holistic set of resources that will not only reinforce the work being done in schools, but will then trickle out into the community as well. And so all of this has happened over the last 4 years, and there have 100% been challenges and many, many lessons learned. I've said this many times about the bandwidth of school districts and teachers, but schools don't have the time to plan for or make the materials needed for mandates like this. They're already balancing other mandates and other things that they need to do to get through this school year. And so that was really what brought together this partnership, this children's safety partnership, to be able to support that. Obviously, anytime there isn't a clear fiscal note, things are challenging because there's a question of where resources come from and time, and making sure that all of this is being done in a way that's effective and quality. And even though it is a mandate, the buy-in isn't always there. And so we have folks who still say, well, we'll just do small pieces of it because this doesn't happen here, or we don't need to talk to our staff about it because this doesn't happen here. We have a mandated reporter policy and that's perfectly sufficient. Like, we don't need to worry about this. And so that's obviously a challenge in trying to figure out how we can either create structures or systems or resources that can support folks, even if they think, maybe this doesn't happen here, which we all know it does happen regardless of where you are. And then COVID, enough said. Nobody was anticipating that. It still is throwing us for a loop. And it's something that has really changed how we've thought about prevention education, particularly for the younger kids, particularly for this pre-K through 5 group, because we recognize that going remote meant that the safe space for a lot of students went away. They weren't going physically to school, which was a safe space for them. And so we had to consider safety in delivering prevention education, knowing that kiddos might be logging in from their homes or from a place that they're staying wasn't a safe space for them to be in. And so a lot of considerations were made about how do we even begin to address this? What kinds of things can we do? If they're only going to engage in one lesson during the year because of COVID, what content is going to be most helpful for them to have? And so just a lot of back and forth, a lot of conversations, figuring out the best approach for that. But where there are challenges, there were also successes. This law gave us an in with school districts that we have never worked with before, which is a really great opportunity to kind of spread awareness and continue to have these conversations. And there is that increase in awareness. And at the same time, we're removing that stigma and that taboo of talking about child sexual abuse prevention. We're removing the taboo about identifying how we're feeling in certain situations, or removing the taboo around consent being a real thing that people need to practice. And so it gave us the opportunity and a platform to be able to talk about what does it mean to be the boss of my body, to talk about anatomically and biologically accurate body terminology, to give kids the message that it's okay to change your mind, which is not necessarily conversations that were always happening. It was also a really cool opportunity to see the good work that was already being done throughout the state by prevention educators, by school districts, by community partners. So many people were already doing this work. And so we went into trainings and folks were saying, I already do this unit on feelings, or I already do this unit about safe adults. Do I need to do more? Am I covering this? Yeah, you're actually already doing the thing. And that's really awesome. And so seeing that good work already being done and then giving additional resources to just kind of allow that to go deeper and to grow was really exciting. And then the ability to train and reach so many people. Over the course of the years we've been doing this, we've trained upwards of 600 plus people, and we've covered every county in the state with folks who have attended trainings. And so that gives us the opportunity to build relationships and to build these networks and connections with folks to engage in this work going forward, which is just a really exciting prospect and one that we're looking forward to continuing to evolve over time. So that's really the content heavy piece. I'm recognizing it's 3:47, but I wanted to just throw my contact information out there because I just dumped a ton of information in your lap. I could keep talking about the Children's Safety Partnership until the sun goes down, but nobody wants me to do that. So if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. The number that you see can reach me regardless of if I'm in the office or not. So just know that I can be reached. You'll see the Children's Safety Partnership website. You see Mikasa's website. Lisa has dropped a whole bunch of resources in the chat, and I'm dropping in another one, which is just kind of a resource guide that contains the implementation guide, the curriculum guidance document, some of the handouts that we give when we do our trainings. So you can have that and kind of peruse and let me know if you have questions. I want to pause before questions and just thank you all for doing the work that you do and for being here today to talk about the Children's Safety Partnership. I'm grateful for each and every one of you. And now I would like to open it up for questions.